In this next segment of Lesson 1, I'm going to talk about why oral language skills are so important for an understanding of adolescent reading, and also introduce some basic concepts that set the stage for the upcoming content in the module. Some people might question the value of focusing on oral language ability in adolescents, given how much else there is to be concerned about. For example, their reading, writing, and math skills, their social skills. If students' speech sounds normal, on the surface, we don't tend to worry too much about oral language. In students that we know have a history of oral language problems, we might even wonder whether it's even possible to improve them or to help them catch up. In the literature, Louisa Cook Moats has been one of the most prolific writers about the need for a stronger teacher knowledge base for oral language. She began with an article back in 1994, Wanted Teachers with Knowledge of Language. This title was repeated 25 years later in the Journal of Learning Disabilities, again, Wanted Teachers with a Knowledge of Language. So let's take a look at the language demands and levels of literacy needed to be successful at school and beyond. We can talk about basic literacy, which typically developing children usually acquire in the primary grades. This is at the bottom of the triangle. This refers to skills such as basic word identification, spelling, use of conventions of print, etc. Once children are beyond the learning to read phase, they enter the intermediate literacy phase, during which time they develop reading comprehension skills, oral reading fluency, and start to expand their vocabulary through reading. Once the content area subjects are introduced, there's a need for specialized literacy skills and knowledge about how to communicate within each discipline. For example, the way knowledge is communicated and taught is different between history and science. So let's take a look at the kinds of language skills students need for success in secondary classrooms so that they can acquire this disciplinary literacy level. They need automatic, efficient, and accurate comprehension of both the oral language that's used in the classroom, which is usually teacher talk, but also could include class discussion with their peers, as well as the language in text materials. And they need to be familiar with the variations in the language use across a wide variety of subject areas, learning materials, and activities. They also need to be able to identify important information, which is usually in language form, and organize it for later use. They have to be able to synthesize information across various learning situations where they might have been listening at one point and then reading, and use reasoning to figure out what is the most salient information for their learning task. They need a lot of mental flexibility in how they use language for the high-level learning activities they have in their secondary classrooms. Making inferences is a high-level language skill where students have to basically construct their own understandings of information, putting ideas together in their mind, listening between the lines and reading between the lines. And finally, they have to be able to use talking and writing flexibly as a means to gather, share, and express ideas and meanings in their subject areas. When we look beyond school at employment, we find that the most valued skills from the employer's standpoint are good writing and oral communication skills, and in the end, the flexibility to handle complex communication situations in the workplace. The good news is that there is a growing evidence base that these oral language skills at higher levels can be fostered and developed during secondary school, and that systematic efforts in this direction do pay off. This next slide shows the model of the language system that we will be referring to during the module, which has been adapted from the model first presented to the AARI presentations in the Summer Institutes that we had at the beginning of the project by Barbara Aaron. The model shows the interconnectedness of the basic levels of language with all of the other language functions: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. As well, higher level cognitive skills such as metacognition are included in the model so that we can talk about how basic skills in syntax, for example, can be used in higher level reading comprehension. Our first few lessons will be focusing on the inner circle of this model, the underpinnings of the language system. It's important to reference some basic terminology for discussions about students' language skills. Language abilities are usually divided into comprehension skills known as receptive language abilities, which can include skills such as vocabulary recognition and listening and even reading comprehension. The other side of the coin is expressive language ability, which entails using the various components of basic language for talking and writing. Another type of division that helps us organize a discussion about the language system is basic versus higher level language skills. Basic level language skills refer to efficient understanding and use of words, grammar, and sentence structures, whereas higher level language skills refer to how we use language to communicate complex ideas, how we use them to communicate socially in conversation, and for a range of other communication purposes. For example, discourse skills refer to putting language together beyond the sentence level and are critical for processing information in teachers' instructional language and in textbooks. These receptive and expressive language skills become important precursors to reading skill development, and this depiction shows language comprehension as one strand of skills that eventually becomes integrated into skilled reading. This reading rope concept was originally developed by Scarborough, who studied how children's early language development could predict later reading ability. This brings us to a model of reading which helps us to understand the pivotal role language abilities play in reading comprehension, which is the ultimate goal or purpose for reading. This model was developed by Hoover and Gough in 1990. And proposes that reading comprehension is the product of two essential skills, word decoding and language comprehension. So, if we think back to the model of language, all of the receptive aspects of basic and higher level language skills are integrated within this concept of language comprehension. Also important in this model is that both components are necessary for fluent reading with comprehension. So, poor decoding skills limit reading comprehension even when receptive language skills are well developed. And conversely, poor language comprehension will also limit reading comprehension even when word decoding skills are good. So now we turn our focus to some more basic concepts that we need to understand about oral language and reading. Our first three lessons will emphasize language structures at the level of words. If we start at the bottom of the slide, we are looking at the sounds of words themselves, or phonemes, from which the concept of phonemic awareness arises, which is a critical precursor of early reading skills and is a term well known to most educators. We'll then move from smaller to larger structures and cover morphology, which is the grammar level of language. And by lesson 3, we'll move to the level of words themselves, talking about the meaning aspect of words, often referred to as semantics. A wide body of research has confirmed the importance of phonemic awareness as an essential skill for learning to read. As we'll see in the various case studies, many students who are poor readers may appear to have reasonably well-developed receptive and expressive language skills on the surface, but they have poor knowledge and awareness of the sound structure of words. For example, they have difficulty breaking words down into individual sounds. And please note that I'm referring to sounds and not letters. This is often a point of confusion. So, with limited ability to identify individual sounds in words, then learning letter-sound correspondences becomes a daunting task and results in poorly developed decoding skills, often very unreliable when it comes to learning to read regular words in the curriculum, and especially decoding unfamiliar words. So our first learning activity will be for you to assess your own phonemic awareness and also your morphological awareness, which we'll be covering next lesson. And also try out some ways to assess these skills in your students. For phonemic awareness, activities like counting syllables and sounds is a good place to start. Syllables are larger chunks of words, and it's often good to start at this level before identifying individual sounds. And you'll see in the practice activities, another way to assess phonemic awareness is to manipulate individual sounds. For example, saying a word and then saying it again, and either deleting or substituting another sound in one of the word positions. For example, we might ask a student to say the word spot, S-P-O-T, and then say it again without saying the S sound, which would give us pot. Or we could have them say it again, but reverse the T and the P sounds, which would give them stop. For morphological awareness, we are really looking at the smallest unit of grammatical meaning, the morpheme. So all whole words are themselves morphemes, usually called free morphemes. Morphemes can also be parts of a word that carry meaning. These are called bound morphemes. For example, the S sound on the word ducks tells us that the word is plural, and the ing on the word swimming tells us that we are in the present tense. Other important morphemes are the affixes that are attached to words that signify specific meanings, what we usually refer to as prefixes and suffixes. To assess morphological awareness, you can start with multisyllabic words and then break them down to their morphological parts and identify the function of the bound morphemes. For example, the word unhappy has two morphemes, happy being the base or root word, or the free morpheme, and un being the bound morpheme that means not. You can also start with a root word and build up variations of the word using affixes and identify how each affix changes the word meaning. For example, going from the word study to studied, studying, student, and other function words that are syntactic supports for words, such as had or may have. So now I'd like you to try this yourself and assess your own phonemic awareness and morphological awareness skills using the practice sheets that have been prepared for you. After you've practiced with these concepts, you should try out the assessment tasks with your own students using vocabulary from your content area. In the MOTS text, there are lots of useful resources to help you start dealing with words at the phonemic and morphological level, and I encourage you to go through these examples as well. Your last assignment for this part of the lesson is to have you take some time and reflect on some students that you've taught in the past who, now that you know more about the language system, you may start to be thinking that they have language difficulties or oral language delays or deficiencies that perhaps you hadn't recognized before, and that this has probably been one of the roots of their performance difficulties in the classroom, particularly in the area of reading. In your response, you could comment on one student or two or three students, but try to, in your responses, relate some of the observations that you have to the language model that was presented earlier in the lesson, the functional model of all the parts, and also to the simple view of reading.